It is the 12th of October, and the United Nations General Assembly is meeting in New York. It is a very tense meeting in the Cold War era. Individual speeches are punctuated by shouting, disapproving whistling and booing. But as it soon turns out, that is far from all. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev takes the floor, reacting angrily to accusations that the Soviet Union is occupying Eastern Europe. First he shouts obscenities at his speaker. Then, according to some accounts, he even takes off his shoe and bangs it on the lectern in a fit of rage. With his speech, Khrushchev confirmed his reputation as a controversial and erratic politician who, on the one hand, publicly named the crimes of his predecessor Joseph Stalin and thus ushered in the thaw, but on the other hand, it was he who had the uprising in Hungary crushed by Soviet tanks, who decided to build the Berlin Wall or brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev was born in the village of Kalinovka, 11 kilometers east of the present-day Russian-Ukrainian border. His parents were poor peasants barely making ends meet. When Nikita was 14, he and his family went to work in the town of Yuzovka, now Donetsk, where he worked as a metalworker. His worldview was initially influenced mainly by his father, who was an active trade unionist and spread the idea of socialism among the workers. And his son was also gradually completely absorbed by politics. He joined the party in 1918 when he was 24 years old. During the civil war that broke out in Russia after the Great October Revolution, he was in charge of the ideological education of soldiers and volunteers. The first big break in his political career came after he met Lazar Kaganovich. He was a close associate of Joseph Stalin, who became the head of the communists in Ukraine in 1925. And Khrushchev began to rise higher and higher on the ladder of power alongside him. In 1933, he became the party's Moscow secretary, and 6 years later, at the age of 45, a member of the Politburo, the country's narrowest leadership. From that moment, his great wish was finally fulfilled. He came into close proximity to the great Stalin. Khrushchev at that time, as he would later confess, admired Stalin immensely. Even the mass purges that Stalin unleashed, in which thousands of people ended up on the scaffold and millions more in the gulags, did not change that. On the contrary, Khrushchev not only supported these atrocities, but was himself very active in them. He took the initiative to increase the quotas for those arrested and executed, the so-called enemies of socialism. For example, in the Moscow region, which he headed, only 3 of the 38 top party leaders survived the Stalinist purges. After the Second World War, during which he served again as a political commander, including during the Battle of Stalingrad, Khrushchev returned first to Moscow and then again to Ukraine. He considered himself the party's chief expert on agriculture and came up with a revolutionary proposal. He wanted to build a giant milk pipeline to bring hot milk from the countryside to Kiev. This was too much even for Stalin, who rejected the idea and branded Khrushchev a fantasizing megalomaniac. When Stalin died in March 1953, a succession struggle broke out among his followers. A smiling man with the broad face of a peasant, he was not considered a serious candidate for the highest party office. Much more famous candidates were the then head of the Secret Service, Lavrenti Beria, and Stalin's longtime personal secretary, Georgy Malenkov. But Khrushchev managed to shake them both off. Beria ended up on death row in June 1953 after being accused of espionage at a Politburo meeting. Malenkov preferred to give up his candidacy after a behind-the-scenes fight. Nikita Khrushchev first becomes first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party on September 14, 1953, and his position as the most powerful man in the country is finally consolidated on March 27, 1959, when he also receives the highest government post, he will become chairman of the Council of Ministers, the Soviet government. Nikita Khrushchev made history several times. It was on his initiative that in February 1954, just a few months after his election, a decree was passed by the Supreme Soviet that removed the Crimean Peninsula from Russia's administration and incorporated it into Ukraine. In the context of the Soviet Union, this was a mere administrative formality, but after its collapse it proved to be a major step, the consequences of which we are watching with trepidation even today. It was also he, a former hard Stalinist, who delivered a now legendary speech entitled On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February '56. In it, Khrushchev publicly named and denounced the dictatorial practices of his predecessor Joseph Stalin in front of shocked delegates, ushering in the so-called thaw and a series of positive changes. Totalitarian power in the country began to loosen. Hundreds of thousands of political prisoners returned from the gulags, censorship was partially relaxed, and minor economic reforms were introduced. But it was clear from the start that this was not going to be a Western-style democracy. This was fully confirmed in the autumn of the same year. Then, under the influence of events in the Soviet Union, there was a thaw in some other countries of the socialist bloc. In Hungary, events grew into a nationwide anti-communist uprising. Initially relatively peaceful protests by Hungarians against the authoritarian regime turned into a bloody riot within a few days. Khrushchev decided to take decisive action. He sent tanks into the troubled country, shot up the uprising, and installed a new pro-Soviet leadership. The fighting claimed 4,000 lives. In relation to the West, Khrushchev sought peaceful coexistence. In 1959, he was even the first top leader of the Soviet Union to make an official visit to the United States. Paradoxically, however, it was the same Nikita Khrushchev under whose reign the world came as close as ever to nuclear conflict during the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis. The cause was the Soviet effort to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba, about 100 miles from American shores. The crisis lasted for 13 days, and the conflict was averted by a last-minute agreement between the two powers. Among other things, it was because of his erratic politics and critical view of the Stalinist period that Nikita Khrushchev had to fight his party rivals almost all the time in office. Already in 1957, for example, he faced an attempted putsch, which was backed by 3 deputy prime ministers of his government. Khrushchev thwarted the attempt to recall him, but did not have the organizers executed or interned, following the example of his predecessor. He merely removed them from top positions. In the end, Nikita Khrushchev spent 11 years at the head of the Soviet communists. But as his political missteps and economic failures mounted, his power steadily waned. The change in Soviet leadership finally occurred shortly after Khrushchev's visit to Czechoslovakia, which became his last foreign trip. Party rivals removed him in October 1964, but he formally asked to be relieved of both posts himself, for health reasons and because of his advanced age. In his place came the then number 2 man in the party hierarchy, Leonid Brezhnev. Khrushchev was then in the last 7 years of his life. He spent them in seclusion at his dacha, where he wrote his memoirs. He died 1971 at the age of 77 of heart failure. He did not have a state funeral, and the main party newspaper announced his demise in a one-sentence report. The Soviet Union and the entire socialist bloc were already fully ruled by the hard hand of Leonid Brezhnev at that time, and nothing was to change until the 80s.